Hi there, my name is Seakga Tladi and this is our program for today. So today we're unpacking two critical issues that, are pretty important in South Africa and widely in the continent. First, in the wake of President Cyril Ramaposa's national address, we tackle South Africa's highly charged migration debate. Is the government effectively fixing an administrative border crisis or dangerously conflating it with a human rights emergency? We're going to be looking at some of the hard data and policy promises with political analyst Tlumelo Aba. Then we're going to turn our focus to the north. As severe Ebola outbreaks test Central and East Africa, Zimbabwe has stepped up with a $1 million pledge to the African Center for Disease Control and Prevention. Are we finally witnessing the dawn of true African health sovereignty? We unpack the shift away from foreign donor reliance with an academic who's been on the show multiple times before, and someone who we always like to have on when we talk about Zimbabwe. His name is Mr. Lazarus Sauti from the University of Zimbabwe. These are two massive conversations, one packed show. Stay with us right here. Welcome back to our program, and thank you for joining us. So South Africa woke up in the 7th of June. On the 7th of June, South Africa stayed up for a presidential address that had many people reaching for their phones, their remotes, and their voices. On Sunday evening, President Cyril Ramaposa stood before the nation at the Union Buildings in Tshwane and delivered what he called a comprehensive response to one of the country's most emotionally charged debates: migration and illegal immigration in particular. In the weeks and months before the president's address, South Africans from Johannesburg to Durban, from Cape Town to Limpopo, had been asking quite loudly where the government was listening. Anti-foreigner protests organized by movements like March and March have turned violent in several cities. Foreign-owned spaza shops were being targeted. Migrants were being blocked from accessing public health clinics. And social media was on fire with a mix of genuine grievance, misinformation, and in some cases, outright hatred and xenophobia. So on the show right now, we're going to be unpacking what the president actually said. We're going to ask whether the speech holds together under critical scrutiny. And then we'll look at some hard data on South Africa's social and economic challenges. And we're going to be examining the dangerous conflation at the heart of this debate. The idea that illegal immigration, which is largely an administrative problem, is somehow the same thing as xenophobia, which is a human rights crisis. Can South Africa fix these issues once and for all? And what does it even mean for South Africa to fix these issues? We're going to try and answer those questions on the show today with the help of our guest, who's going to join us later in the program. So this is going to be a very, very rich conversation, one that we must start with the context. South Africa is not a country that is unacquainted with the migration question. Our own history is one of forced removals, migrant label systems under the apartheid government, and post-1994, we're a country of waves of people arriving from across the continent, people fleeing poverty, fleeing conflict, and in some cases, outright persecution. President Ramaphosa acknowledged this history in his address. He said that our country, like many others throughout history, is a product of migration. He described migration as contributing to South Africa's diversity and vibrancy. He even said that South Africa is a better country for migration, and those words deserve recognition because they run against the political grain of what we've been hearing in the streets. But then the speech does also get somewhat complicated, and this is where we need to be quite critical in our analysis of what our president's saying. It's not constructive, in my view, for us to take everything that our leaders say at face value and not really put it to the intellectual test. The president was addressing two distinct, in some ways opposed audiences at the same time. On one side, the president was addressing South Africans who are genuinely frustrated, people who feel like their communities are under pressure from undocumented migrants, people who are unemployed and feel like they're being undercut by workers who have no legal protections. On the other side, the president was talking to the international community, African brother and sister nations, human rights organizations, and the migrants themselves. And all of these groups would have been watching to see whether South Africa would allow or slide into institutionalized hostility towards migrants. Ramaphosa tried to speak to both, and in doing so, his address, from my perspective, risked something somewhat intellectually dishonest. Treating illegal immigration and xenophobia as if they are two sides of the same coin, two problems that must simply be balanced. But the problem is that they're not. They're not at all equivalent problems, and they don't belong in the same moral or administrative category or legal category either. See, here's why this matters. Illegal immigration is an administrative issue. It's about border management. It's about documentation. It's about legal frameworks and the capacity of our law enforcement to do their jobs. It's about government systems. It's a problem that governments all over the world deal with, especially governments in perhaps more developed countries or more economically prosperous countries like South Africa relative to the rest of our region. It's a problem that all countries that are similar to South Africa will have to deal with. And they deal with this through law, through policy, and through bureaucracy. Xenophobia, however, is a human rights crisis. It is violence, discrimination, and dehumanization directed at people based on their national origin. Earlier this year, Human Rights Watch documented violent xenophobic attacks targeting African and Asian foreign nationals in major cities. People were beaten with sjamboks, shops were ransacked, people were blocked from receiving healthcare at public clinics that they have a constitutional right to access. These are not administrative failures. These are crimes. And when a president gives a speech that alternates between calling for tougher enforcement and calling for an end to xenophobia without making an ironclad and strong and authoritative distinction between the two, there's a risk that ordinary South Africans might hear that, you know what, your frustrations are valid and things are going to get tougher on foreigners. And that, for me, is just a politically convenient message. It is not necessarily one that is just. It is not necessarily the right message. So the question we must ask is this one. Is the president taking a principled stand? Or is His Excellency playing both sides? Because I think you can't in good conscience warn against xenophobia in the same breath as you announce tougher deportation drives without making it absolutely clear that these are categorically different responses to categorically different problems. The address did make some admirable distinctions. Ramaphosa was explicit that only authorized officials can enforce immigration laws and that no individual has the right to confront someone in the streets to demand proof of nationality. Our president condemned those who seek to exploit migration concerns for political, personal, and criminal agendas. And those are important lines. But they exist alongside enforcement language that in the current climate risks being heard as validation for this vigilantism and not a deterrent to it. These distinctions are made at the same time or they are framed as if they are equivalent when really they are not. The big focus should be addressing the xenophobic sentiment and in a very strong way. And we will return to the solutions that the president did outline in his speech. But first, let's put some facts on the table about the real state of South Africa. Because if we are honest about the data, the picture is a lot more complicated than this migration debate allows. Right? You can't have an honest conversation about migration in South Africa without looking at the underlying social and economic conditions. Because the frustration that many South Africans feel is real. Even if it is being misdirected, it's very real frustration. So let's look at employment first. According to Statistics South Africa, in the first quarter of 2026, the national unemployment rate rose to 32.7%. That means roughly 1 in 3 South Africans who want a job cannot find a job. That figure alone should stop us in our tracks. But among the youth, those between 15 and 24, the unemployment rate stands at a staggering 60%. And for those aged 25 to 34, it is 40%. When you add up all young people between 15 and 34 who are not in employment, education, or training, you're looking at more than 4 in 10 young South Africans who are out of the job. Millions of young people who are unemployed. Those statistics are not produced by immigration. These numbers were building for decades through deindustrialization, through failures in education and skills development, through a slow erosion of a manufacturing sector, and through an economy that has simply not grown fast enough to absorb its own people. The youth unemployment rate in 2015 was 36.9%. A decade later, it sits at nearly 46% for the same age group. That trajectory should be blamed on economic policy failures, not on foreign nationals. Now let's look at healthcare. South Africa's constitution guarantees the right to healthcare for everyone within its borders. Citizens, documented migrants, asylum seekers, refugees, everyone who finds themselves in South Africa has got a right to healthcare. And that's an admirable law. That's an admirable law to have. That is, laws like this is why we can often say as South Africa quite proudly that we've got one of the best constitutions in the world, if not the best constitution in the world. That is the letter of our law. But in practice, in 2025 and 2026, anti-immigration vigilante groups were blocking migrants from entering public clinics. The South Gauteng High Court in November 2025 had to issue an injunction against people like Operation Dudula specifically to stop this. Courts had to intervene to enforce a constitutional right. Now, here is what the data on health tells us. South Africa faces a serious burden of disease. HIV remains one of the most significant, and Africa as a continent has fought this battle in large part because of pharmaceutical support from India and other partners. There are real health crises on our doorstep. We have done an interview with Professor Taslim Ras recently that reveals that the cancer detection infrastructure in Southern Africa is minimal at best. None of these problems are caused by migration. Many of these conditions affect migrants and South Africans alike. And then there's the question of inequality. South Africa remains one of the most unequal societies on this planet. And this is a structural condition rooted in the history of our racial capitalism, dispossession, and the failure of post-apartheid economic transformation. When people in townships and informal settlements cannot access dignified work, decent housing, or quality education, their frustrations become legitimate. The question is whether that frustration is being directed at the right targets. And if that target is migrants, then the answer to that is no. A recent GovDem survey found that 73% of South Africans reported not trusting African foreign nationals at all or not very much. These attitudes, researchers warn, if left unaddressed, risk deepening social division. They also fuel misinformation. And the president was right to call this out. But addressing those attitudes requires more than enforcement. It requires the kind of political leadership that educates and not just regulates. The bottom line from the facts: South Africa's social ills are deep, they are structural, and they're largely self-generated. Migration, legal or illegal, did not create the unemployment problem. It did not create infrastructure backlogs in healthcare. It did not create inequality which we've inherited. But migration has become a convenient scapegoat. And that scapegoat, left unchecked, becomes dangerous. Now, let us turn to the president's solutions. He did outline 5 pillars. And credit where credit is due, this was not a vague or empty speech. There were concrete policy commitments. So let's examine 5 of them and ask honestly whether they will work. The first pillar is intensified enforcement. The president announced that the Department of Home Affairs, the Border Management Authority, and the South African Police Service would step up deportations of undocumented migrants. Dedicated immigration courts will be set up, and the government claims it intercepted over 450,000 people trying to enter illegally in the past year alone. The Employment and Labor Department is recruiting new inspectors, labor inspectors, and these are significant commitments. But I guess the question that many of us will be left with is whether our state is capable of delivering on these promises. South Africa has had a capacity problem in the past. Home Affairs is notoriously understaffed and underfunded. The same government that is promising new inspectors has, failed to process asylum applications in reasonable timeframes. So enforcement without institutional reform is more of a headline rather than a solution. But that is the first pillar. The first pillar is increased enforcement. The second pillar, and arguably one of the most important for the economy, is cracking down on capitalist exploitation of migrant labor. This is where the president said something that deserves far more attention than it got. He acknowledged directly that employers in South Africa are hiring undocumented workers specifically because their undocumented status makes them vulnerable. It makes them easier to underpay, easier to overwork, easier to silence whenever they want to bring up problems. So he said that the government will increase penalties for this kind of behavior, including imprisonment for employers who violate the Immigration Act. This is the structural analysis that the debate sometimes skips, right? The exploitation of undocumented migrants is not happening despite capitalism. It is a feature of capitalism. Capitalism relies on having an army of the unemployed. Businesses, particularly in informal and logistics sectors, benefit directly from a workforce that cannot demand or enforce their rights. So addressing this is not just about tougher fines, but about a fundamental shift in how our labor law is enforced. So we need a dramatic intervention like this. It is also the one thing that risks being used to discriminate if it is not implemented with proper oversight. These laws against companies, we should be careful that they don't end up becoming another tool to discriminate against migrant workers if it is not properly implemented. So the one thing that we'll be looking out for very much when it comes to this implementation, this intervention that the president speaks about, cracking down on capitalist exploitation of migrant workers. We need to be very vigilant in how this is implemented. But let's move on to the third pillar, and that is tackling corruption in the immigration system. Ramaposa was candid here. He admitted that illegal immigration is often enabled by corruption. Officials that are selling documents, facilitating unlawful entry. And the plan that our president outlines includes establishing an intelligent population register with biometric data, phasing out green ID books, which has been abused for identity theft, and ending the misuse of traffic registration numbers as forms of identification. These are systemic fixes. They address root causes and not just symptoms. But their effectiveness, again, is going to depend entirely on execution. The fourth pillar that President Ramaphosa mentions is reforming the legal framework. The current immigration laws, the president admitted, are fragmented and contradictory. They contain loopholes, and closing those loopholes is necessary. The National Labour Migration Policy and the Employment Services Amendment Bill are steps in that right direction. The Spaza Shop Fund to support South African informal traders is also there. A nod to the community anger about foreign nationals dominating that local retail. At least it seems like he's giving communities a solution to that problem. And finally, the fifth pillar, that is continental engagement. And this is perhaps one of the most important and one of the most underdeveloped of the five. South Africa said, Ramaphosa said that South Africa cannot address migration challenges alone and that special envoys would be sent to African countries. He acknowledged that migration is driven by conflict, poverty, and lack of opportunity, and those root causes must be addressed regionally. This is a genuine and long-term thinking solution that was brought up in the address. But it does remain vague as well. Sending envoys is a gesture, building continental architecture that reduces the conditions that drive migration requires sustained investment, political will, and genuine multilateral coordination over years, not just months. So this is a great solution, but one that is going to take time. And it's not really a solution. Perhaps solution is the wrong word because, again, of perhaps the vagueness. What are the envoys being sent to do? What sort of measurements should we be using in thinking about what these envoys have done? How do we measure whether they succeeded or not? So as important as it is to build a multilateral, multi-country understanding in addressing this problem, I wish that this pillar that our president mentioned, he at least mentioned in a bit more of a concrete way as to what are the direct goals of sending envoys to other countries and what can we expect. Overall, this speech is better than nothing. It is more sophisticated than the populist demands coming from a lot of the March and March types and the Operation Tutula types. But if it does not dramatically address this problem and improve the conditions that we're living under, it risks being a policy document that sounds good and delivers little. So that is what we are looking out for as we think about the speech that President Ramaphosa gave. Is that how does it address the problem on the ground for ordinary South Africans and for migrants alike? To help us get deeper into this conversation, I'm delighted to be joined by my guest today, Tlumelo Xaba, who is an independent analyst. He is a political and governance analyst. He's based in South Africa, and he is someone who's been thinking about these problems deeply for a long time. So please help me welcome Mr. Tlumelo Xaba to our program. I wanted to speak to you a little bit about President Ramaphosa's recent address to the nation, where he acknowledged South African concern over illegal immigration, or what is viewed as illegal immigration or framed as illegal immigration, including job security and public services. But he has also called for respecting and protecting human dignity. So first, I want to ask you, what do you make of the president's address, and his position about needing to protect borders, as he says, at the same time as managing migration pressures from the SADC and AU sister countries? How important is this balance in your view?
Well, firstly, I want to start off by saying that the president's address was reflective of the government's reactive attitude when it comes to socio-economic and socio-political issues in our country. Because what tends to happen is that our government tends to actually wait for something to happen before they can actually take steps against dealing with that issue, instead of preventing the matter firsthand by taking precautionary measures that would avoid issues happening or surfacing in the first place. illegal immigration in South Africa is not a new phenomenon. It's something that has been happening over time now. Yet we still see a lot of things that lead to these widespread protests happening. Not that these widespread protests are entirely legitimate, because I think they have an element on bordering on xenophobia. So I think I'll just go back to what I said, that in South Africa, the South African government has not really taken any precautionary measures to avoid certain things from happening. Hence, I believe that the president's address was a reactive one. Yes, there are certain things that he alluded to, which should actually be implemented to ensure that we have much more stronger borders. The issue of illegal immigration in South Africa is combated in a manner that is going to be pleasant and ensure that it actually does not surface the way it has been over time. But that's something that's not just going to happen overnight. It's something that's going to take time, of course. But I just believe that another issue which the president did not emphasize too much was the issue of the failure of the state in addressing this issue, because at the center of everything that is happening is the state's inadequacy to deal with illegal immigration.
We speak about illegal immigration not being a new issue in the country. And of course, sentiment against illegal immigration and, like you say, bordering on xenophobic sentiments. I mean, that's what gives you evidence that the issue is at least perceived to be an issue all the way since the early 2000s, flaring up in 2008 and again in 2015 and again now. But I question the veracity, or at least where the claim comes from, because so according to any of the numbers that have been put out there reputably, total immigration in South Africa is about 5% of the population. And most of them, of that 5%, are coming from the SADC region, our neighbor countries, for legitimate reasons. So I guess my question becomes, where do you think, or what reasons are there to suggest that there is this widespread influx of people, this massive, massive problem, as opposed to a small percentage of people?
Well, I think that people don't really appreciate some of the issues you mentioned now in terms of the statistics of the amount of immigrants that are in South Africa. Well, I'm assuming that the number that you're mentioning now are those that are here legally, so which have been documented, which have actually been recorded even in Home Affairs. However, I think we cannot run away from the fact that there are a large number of people in South Africa that are unaccounted for, which is where the problem is. And I will actually say that people do have a right to advocate against the issue of illegal immigration, like we see with March and everyone else that has been pioneering the issue of illegal immigration, right, to protest and all of that. But like I mentioned, that it should not border on xenophobia. But if you can look at the rhetorics that have been made, or the sentiments that have been articulated by those that are pioneering this whole issue of immigrants, or I'll say immigrants because it hasn't really now been about illegal immigrants only, but it is an issue that has even turned into that has even been made about immigrants in general in South Africa. And before I actually close on this, land on this matter, it shouldn't go unsaid that South Africa is the economic hub of the SADC region, and to a larger extent the African continent. So it would be expected that people will migrate here.
Of course, the same way that you find people migrating to Gauteng from other parts of South Africa, people migrate for economic opportunity, and in South Africa is where it's found. Mr. Tlaba, the president has also been very adamant on collaborating with other African countries, choosing to send envoys to other African countries to discuss these matters with their leaders. And he said that that South Africa must build an Africa where people live by choice and not by desperation, through lawful migration management without allowing xenophobia or violence. So, how important is that sort of conducive system of movement between our countries for any meaningful regional cooperation within the SADC region and within Africa on the bigger scale?
I think I'll start off by saying that we need to appreciate the fact that we live in a globalized world where people move to any country for various reasons. Some move to another country for educational purposes, some move to other countries for economic or social reasons. So I think that's the first thing that we need to appreciate, that it's not just the globalization is not just something that happens within the African continent. I think that within an African context, we need to understand. I'll go back to what I said, that South Africa is Africa's economic anchor. Hence, we also, I think this was said by Prof. Lumumba, that this is South Africa is Africa's economic anchor, and it is expected that people are going to migrate here for various reasons. However, I do believe that in other countries, for instance, you find that a lot of people migrate to South Africa because they are being persecuted politically, like we saw with Nelson Chamisa in Zimbabwe. The political conditions in other countries, such as the DRC, for instance, such as Zimbabwe, are very much hostile, enabling a situation whereby people are going to come to South Africa to come and take refuge. So I think that's another issue that we need to look at. And this is something that has been happening over time, by the way. I remember some few years ago, there's a migrant from Rwanda that I was speaking to, and he actually told me that he hasn't been in his country since 1994. You'll remember that there was a genocide in Rwanda during that time. So ever since then, he has been in South Africa because he came to take refuge. So these are some of the issues which we need to look at insofar as immigration is concerned. Yes, people come to South Africa for different reasons, but I believe that once they're here, they need to be put under different categories and actually be documented or be here legally. So I think the issue here is whether people are here legally or not. And I also believe, like I mentioned, that there is a huge inadequacy within the state to address the issue of migration in South Africa. And that's what the president, like I mentioned, did not really dwell on much, because even the SIU report a few months back actually did highlight the fact that there was rampant corruption within Home Affairs. Even Shepard Bushiri was here illegally, and as a result of colluding with officials at the Home Affairs Department. So I think that the inadequacies within the state and the rot that is within the state needs to be addressed. And you can only address that by strengthening internal controls and by strengthening the accountability systems within government.
I think at the very least, that's a fair assessment. Um, the president did speak about also employers who exploit undocumented workers. And this is another systemic part of the problem where, you know, employers, because they want to make more and more profits, obviously paying undocumented people less is more effective for them. How important is addressing this part of the problem as well? Protecting migrant workers, meaning getting them a fair salary, and also protecting South African workers as well.
Something that we need to understand is that exploitation in South Africa is not a contemporary phenomenon. It's something that has been going on for centuries, actually, because we need to understand that the bedrock of South Africa's economy was actually built by Africans and also by migrants who came from other parts of the world, in particular Africa. If you can even look as early as the 7th, 8th, 17th, and 18th century, you'll realize that the colonizers actually did not build this economy by themselves. They actually needed human capital from other parts of the world. So the issue of exploitation and actually taking people from outside of the country is not something that only started now. It's something that has been happening for centuries. And I think it has actually persisted up until the point that we are in now.
What I'm hearing then is, or how we can interpret this then, is that the anger that we see manifesting in some of these, as you say, anti-immigration protests bordering on xenophobia, as we see those, the ire of the people is pointed in the wrong direction. The problem is a governance and business class problem rather than a working class problem, because that foreigner is or the undocumented migrant, the documented migrant, we're all victims in the same way of a lot of the same systems.
No, that's absolutely correct. And I'll take you back to when there was illegal mining, like a crisis of illegal mining in Northwest. I think it was about a year or two ago. A lot of the people that were actually found in those mines are people that were from neighboring countries such as Mozambique, Zimbabwe, Lesotho, etc. So what that actually told me was that in actual fact, a lot of these people come here and come get told that they're going to get jobs and that the economic opportunities for them were all to only to find out that they'll be stuck underground and that they'll need to be taken out or be arrested after they've been taken out underground. So you then ask yourself the question also that how is it that there is so much illegal mining in South Africa, and whose interest are these people serving if the government is not taking any initiative to close down those mines or to even actually ensure that they maybe partner up with whichever private mining company that has a license in order to ensure that it's legitimate. So I think I'll go back to what I said, that this whole thing is an entire ecosystem of state and non-state actors who are benefiting illegally so from all the activities that are happening. So I actually agree when you are saying that. You're actually quite correct when you are saying that it's a governance and a political problem that is causing all of this chaos that we are seeing in our country. And it's not something that is happening within the migration rather the migration industry or sector, but it's something that is happening across the board where we find those that are in government and those that are outside actually colluding to collapse systems in government to benefit themselves.
Now, the we have in Africa, oh, a strong point for me, maybe because I'm an optimist, but we've got institutions that are at least somewhat credible, and those institutions, like our SADC region and SADC as an institution, as well as the African Union institution, what role should they play in addressing the economic factors of this, the conflict-driven factors of this, where people are fleeing for refuge, and the poverty measures that drive migration?
I think the issue with multilateralism or multilateral institutions, rather, not just in Africa but across the world, is that they have really been falling short in terms of addressing global issues that are affecting human beings. If you can look at the UN with the issue with the UN and the UN Security Council with the Middle East war, you'll find that they've done little to nothing to combat that issue. Even if you look at the AU now, with everything that has been happening in Africa, such as the illegitimate governments or where elections get rigged and where you see that people get persecuted for no reason, some even get killed actually for standing up against the government. When you look at these things, you'll realize that these are crimes against humanity, and these are which lead to a humanitarian crisis.
Right, welcome back to our show. We have just been talking to Hlumelo Xaba about President Ramaphosa's address to the nation, where the president was trying to unveil his plan for addressing the concern over immigration that we are seeing in South Africa. That's one way to put it. Or you could just say the xenophobia that we're seeing in South Africa. That is another, perhaps more accurate way to put it. And we've just had that conversation with Mr. Xaba there, but now it is time to move on, and we are moving on to Zimbabwe, particularly an important question, right, about Zimbabwe's support for the Africa Center for Disease Control and Prevention. And the question is whether Zimbabwe's support for this center is a sign that Africa is beginning to take greater control of its own health security. This question comes after Zimbabwe announced a pledge of $1 million to support Africa CDC response to the ongoing Ebola outbreak affecting parts of Central and East Africa. The contribution follows an appeal from the Africa CDC as the continent mobilizes resources to contain an outbreak that has spread across the DRC and into neighboring Uganda. Zimbabwe has described its pledge as both a practical response to a regional health threat and an expression of Pan-African solidarity. The development arrives at a particularly significant moment for the African public health sphere because for decades, responses to major disease outbreaks on the continent have often depended heavily on external donors, international organizations, or foreign governments, right? Yet, in recent years, African leaders and institutions have increasingly argued that sustainable health security requires Africa to build and finance its own systems, strengthen regional cooperation as it pertains to health, and reduce dependence on outside funding. The current Ebola outbreak is testing exactly that vision. The outbreak involves the Bundibugyo strain of the Ebola virus and has become one of the most serious public health emergencies facing the region. Africa's CDC and the World Health Organization recently launched a joint continental preparedness and response plan that aims to raise more than $500 million to strengthen surveillance, testing, treatment, and community engagement and emergency coordination across affected countries and neighboring states. So, to understand why Zimbabwe's pledge matters, it is important to appreciate the scale of the emergency in the DRC and in Uganda. In the DRC, the outbreak continues to expand. According to recent World Health Organization figures, the country has recorded more than 500 confirmed Ebola cases and over 90 deaths, with infections reported across multiple regions. Most cases remain concentrated in Ituri province, but health authorities remain concerned about continued geographic spread and the potential for further regional transmission. Recent updates indicate that the number of confirmed cases has now reached approximately 550, while deaths have exceeded 100. Health officials say the outbreak will likely spread for weeks, or the outbreak was likely spreading for weeks before it was officially identified, making containment considerably more difficult. Efforts have also been complicated by the insecurity, the presence by insecurity in the region, the presence of armed groups in affected areas, and persistent mistrust among local communities. Contact tracing, one of the most important tools in controlling Ebola outbreaks, has improved but remains below international targets. The World Health Organization says tracing rates remain well below the desired 90 to 95% coverage needed to effectively interrupt chains of transmission of this disease. The situation is not only confined to Congo as well. Uganda has recorded confirmed cases linked to cross-border transmission as well. Authorities there have reported 19 confirmed infections and several deaths. Importantly, Ugandan health officials have moved quickly to strengthen surveillance, testing, and border screening measures. The country's response has received praise from the World Health Organization, which has highlighted Uganda's rapid detection systems and strong public health infrastructure as important factors limiting wider community transmission of this disease. The World Health Organization Director General, Dr. Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus, recently commended Uganda's management of the outbreak and stressed the importance of continued regional cooperation as countries work together to prevent further spread. Beyond the immediate health emergency, however, this outbreak has reignited broader conversations about health sovereignty. Health sovereignty refers to the ability of countries and regions to protect the health of their populations through systems that they own, govern, and finance themselves. It's an idea that the decisions about public health priorities, emergency responses, and health investments should increasingly be driven by African institutions and African governments rather than being dependent on the priorities of external donors. This debate has become especially relevant at a time when global development assistance is facing growing uncertainty. Many donor countries are reassessing international spending priorities, while humanitarian and health organizations have warned that funding shortages are affecting responses to disease outbreaks, vaccination campaigns, and healthcare delivery across several regions. I mean, we've seen it with the American administration. The American administration has almost tied or twisted the arms of various African nations in terms of health funding by forcing them to sort of renegotiate new deals. This is something that we will talk about more when we get into our interview with Mr. Lazarus Sauti, and we talk about this in a bit more detail. But here again, we see the potential pitfalls of not having health sovereignty. Is that when a country like America comes and they say, I need you to renegotiate whatever health assistance that I'm giving you, and I need you to meet these conditions or else I'll pull my funding away. If we do not have health sovereignty, we remain vulnerable to that sort of bullying and antagonism, that sort of hegemonic control that Africa has been victim to for a long time. So, against that backdrop, contributions from African governments to the Africa CDC take on additional significance. Zimbabwe's $1 million pledge may not solve the entire funding challenge, but symbolically, it represents something larger. It demonstrates a willingness by an African state to contribute directly to a continental institution that is tasked with protecting African public health. South Africa has also been among the countries supporting regional health security efforts through contributions, technical expertise, and public health capacity building initiatives. Together, such efforts suggest the beginnings, the roots of a model in which African countries increasingly invest in collective preparedness rather than relying exclusively on external assistance. Supporters of this argue that the approach strengthens accountability, allows African institutions to set their own priorities, and helps to ensure that responses are tailored to the realities of local communities. But we must talk about the critics as well, right? They point out that many African governments continue to face severe fiscal pressures, competing development priorities, and strained healthcare systems at home. So, while continental solidarity is important, long-term success depends on whether African governments can sustain such commitments over a long time and build institutional capacity that is needed to manage future health emergencies. This is a big theme that we spoke about in my interview with Mr. Lazarus Sauti as well. These are important questions because outbreaks such as Ebola do not respect national borders. We've heard this time and time again. Health security of one country increasingly depends on the preparedness of its neighbors as well. An outbreak in Eastern Congo can rapidly create risks for Uganda, for Rwanda, for Kenya. We know that Kenya has also began preparing for a possible Ebola outbreak in its own country. We know this from President William Ruto's state visit, which we attended. So, this reality has made regional coordination and collective financing more important than ever before. So, does Zimbabwe's contribution represent a turning point in how Africa responds to public health emergencies? I don't know. Are we witnessing the emergence of a stronger model of African health sovereignty? What will it take for the Africa CDC and national governments to build a truly self-sustaining continental health security system? Those are some of the questions that we should be asking ourselves. And to unpack these questions, we are joined by a political analyst and academic from the University of Zimbabwe. Please help me welcome onto our show today, Mr. Lazarus Sauti. It's always a pleasure to have you on whenever we need to talk Zimbabwe. And today we're going to be talking a little bit about health and, Africa taking steps to be able to fund its own health in a sovereign manner, because in an interview, Foreign Affairs and International Trade Minister Professor Amon Murirwa has said that the Zimbabwean President Mnangagwa, has directed funds into the African CDC to the tune of $1 million. And this is to help contain or fight the outbreak of Ebola virus on the continent, which has claimed 220 people about in the DRC and some of its neighboring countries. So, first and foremost, as a Zimbabwean citizen, as someone thinking critically about issues in Zimbabwe, framing from a health sovereignty perspective, how significant is this pledge of $1 million to the African CDC in practical terms? And what does it mean for the countries whom the cash is going to, and for Zimbabwe and for an African continent?
Okay, thank you very much. First things first, the mandate of Zimbabwe as one of the member states of the African Union is to promote peace and security. And when it comes to peace and security, we are talking about human security provisions, human security, we are talking about environmental security, food security, community security. And the donation by His Excellency President Emmerson Mnangagwa to the Africa Centers for Disease Control and Prevention is a testament that Zimbabwe is a key player when it comes to promoting human security on the African continent. The purpose is to combat and to contain the spread of Ebola. One thing that is so clear is Zimbabwe is Ebola-free for now. And what stimulated the president to make this donation is to promote youth sovereignty in Africa, is to be an active participant, especially when it comes to African solutions to African problems. The president is playing a leading role, and to Zimbabweans, this is a welcome gesture since he is contributing towards peace, security, stability on the African continent.
Now, I guess the political message there is quite clear, and it is the message of Africa needing to find African solutions for African problems. And we have seen a decline in donor financing coming from the West, with the United States pulling out a lot of their findings. So how does such a pledge reflect long-term shifts towards African self-reliance in health security?
When it comes to development in Africa, the argument pushed by so many actors, development partners, political scientists, media practitioners, is that aid is stimulating development, but aid without fair trade is not enough. And this argument comes again from another school of thought that is informed by this thinking that aid always come with conditions. So when it comes to this contribution by the President of Zimbabwe to the Africa Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, his message is that as Africans, we can use our resources, we can leverage our resources to fight all the problems that hold development. So to speak, we can use our local owned resources to fight diseases, to fight hunger, to fight environmental disasters. But to be specific to the discussion, we are using our resources, our financial resources, to ensure that Ebola is not affecting the general citizenry of Africa. And it's a welcome development, as I said before, because it's a move that should be celebrated, coming from the background that we are not attaching any conditions to this donation. It's just a donation from an African country to other African countries, to peer leaders who really need help and support to combat, to contain the spread of Ebola. And another thing is when it comes to this, it is part of a broader continental strategy because the donation supports a larger 518 million joint strategic financial plan aimed also at responding towards the spread of Ebola. Ebola is a dangerous disease, and as Africans, what we really need is a healthy citizenry, a citizenry that can defend the sovereignty of the continent, not a citizenry that is weak, a citizenry that is opening its hands, that is also lifting its begging bow to Western countries and to look for aid that comes with conditions.
You know, as it pertains to US aid particularly, as of the end of last year in November, the US began having bilateral health negotiations. So, with about 16 African countries, instead of the blanket medical aid that the Americans used to provide for many developing countries, they've now got these bilateral relationships. And this has also been confirmed by the African Centers for Disease Control Director General, Dr. Jean Kaseya. So my question is, in light of, you know, some countries accepting these bilateral deals with the United States and some countries not, how does it bode for health sovereignty if we're not communicating and negotiating from a unified position? If single countries can negotiate different deals, do we not undercut each other in some ways as it comes to that health sovereignty?
Okay, the African Union should speak with one voice, especially when it comes to problems affecting member states. And when it comes to the African Union peace and the security architecture, the message is clear. As African countries, we have to join hands and fight all the scourges that halt development or that threaten peace and security on the continent. Back to your question now, when it comes to the United States, it is operating its international medical aid assistance under the America First Global Health Strategy. And this strategy primarily uses one-on-one bilateral health cooperation MOUs. And as Africa, for us to be safer from being divided by this strategy, we need to pull resources together. We need to work together and have maybe a financial muscle that we can use to deal with the health problems that are affecting people today. And as part of the strategy, what we really need is direct financing. Zimbabwe did its part, and we have to encourage more African countries also to donate towards combating the Ebola disease in Zimbabwe. This can only be effective if we are speaking with one voice, if we are dealing with our problems using grassroots African mechanisms. The reason why most of our strategies fail here in Africa is that we are borrowing the Western template, and the Western template is pushed by countries, powerful countries like the United States through the America First Global Health Strategy. And this template is not good for us because, as I said, it comes with conditions and it is foreign to issues that speak to us as Africans. So we need to be vocal now as Africans. We need to self-introspect. We need to have honest conversations with ourselves, African leaders to African leaders, African citizens to African citizens, research and development institutions to research and development institutions on the best ways that we can use to leverage our resources to come up with a financial muscle that can stimulate health security in Africa.
Yeah, and I mean, in some ways, South Africa has started to do that with our $1 million pledge. Zimbabwe has started to do that with Zimbabwe's $1 million pledge. But now it needs to become a strong system, an institution which is firm and strong and can support African health and development goals. With trying to form this sort of strong financial network to support African fights against health, African solutions for African problems. With building that sort of architecture, what governance and accountability mechanisms should accompany this continental funding so that these monies, the monies that Zimbabwe is sending, the monies that South Africa is sending, these monies are allocated quickly, effectively, and equitably during emergencies?
Okay, so when it comes to the issue of governance framework, the African Union is pushing the African governance architecture, the AGA. And as part of this framework, the golden rule is the promotion of accountability structures within African member states, African countries, the issues of risk boundaries that are needed to secure interconnected financial institutions, the issue of financial prudence and financial integrity, and also issues to do with regulatory alignment. But for us to safeguard the finances that are being put together to combat the spread of Ebola, I think the African Union should appoint a governing board that oversees strategic network alignment in Africa. And this board should have a clear mandate. It should have terms of references. What we expect is for them to evaluate the need to assess, to do an environmental scanning on countries that are suffering from Ebola, the resources they need to survive, the status of their basic health care infrastructures, and we pool resources to ensure, to bridge the gap now, to ensure that the marginalized are benefiting from the donations from countries like Zimbabwe and South Africa, to also ensure that the financial resources that are being put together are ring-fenced. They are not being abused or used for other purposes besides fighting the scourge of Ebola in Africa. Then maybe also one of the most effective means is to ensure continuous regulatory compliance when it comes to financial resources in Africa. And the African Union as the continental motherboard should now ensure that African countries, member states in Africa, are aligning with the African governance frameworks, the African governance architecture, and it's a high time we should also use the African peer review mechanism, not only for political reasons, but also for economic reasons, to ensure that the African continent is speaking with one voice, not only speaking with one voice, but it is working together to champion solutions that speak to Africans, solutions that protect solutions that protect Africans from human insecurities. And once we follow this pattern, I think most African countries will benefit from a continental motherboard perspective. But countries that are directly affected by Ebola should also use their governance infrastructures, their governance institutions to protect these financial resources. Remember, these countries are helping, and as such, the only good gesture they can receive from the countries that are benefiting from the donations is effective use of the financial resources, effective in terms of using them to safeguard the lives of the general citizenry, especially those who are economically disenfranchised.
You bring up a very interesting idea about systematizing a lot of the health bodies we have, particularly in the African Union, into a governing body that'll look after health funding on the continent. And, Africa has got no shortage of various different organs that are focused on this matter, but to bring them together like that seems like an interesting idea. And I mean, this is something that has been discussed at the Africa CDC headquarters in July of 2025. And at this meeting, the Director General, Dr. Jean Kasia, met with Her Excellency Amatum Amoa, the African Union Commissioner of Health, and they had conversations around establishing a joint coordinating team. So this idea that you bring up wouldn't be new, but it's high time that ideas like this are implemented so that those governance and accountability mechanisms can be implemented, like you say. Finally, and maybe we can end on this note, is that what sort of relationship then should this type of body have with the World Health Organization?
Fantastic. A very good question. So when it comes to the Africa Centers for Disease Control, Prevention, it is a public health agency of the African Union, and its mandate is number one, to ensure disease surveillance, to carry out disease surveillance within and across Africa. Number two, to ensure emergency response, especially when it comes to pandemics. Number three, to strengthen health systems. So when it comes now to the linkages, the expected linkages between the AU and the World Health Organization, I think at an executive level, it is about sharing notes, especially on how to combat pandemics. Remember, the World Health Organization has a bigger financial muscle because of the funding from the United Nations. And when it comes now to combating diseases, it is better positioned to fight scourges, to fight pandemics, because of its financial muscle and because of its expertise. So the World Health Organization should transfer its expertise to the leaders of the African Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, so as to assist them when it comes to carrying out continent-wide disease surveillance. And the other thing is also to support the AU, especially when it comes to emergency response, when it comes to early warning mechanisms. Because when it comes to early warning mechanisms, the standard rule is that prevention is better than cure, and experience is the best teacher. Who is more experienced in terms of dealing with diseases between the World Health Organization and the African Union, the Africa Centers for Disease Control and Prevention? Of course, it is the World Health Organization. So the World Health Organization should use its experience and help the African Union through these agents to also respond to the Ebola and other pandemics. And lastly, maybe we can also talk about strengthening health systems in Africa. As an agent, the African Centers for Disease Control and Prevention should work with relevant ministries and departments in Africa, should train our health practitioners on best practices they need to deal with Ebola and other diseases. I think by so doing, we can ensure, or we can prolong health security of Africans.
All right, Mr. Sauti, thank you so much for joining us today to speak about this $1 million pledge that Zimbabwe has made towards the African Center for Disease Control and Prevention to combat this outbreak of Ebola. And we've taken the conversation a bit further, talking about Africa as a whole and needing to build sovereign health systems. And perhaps this is a small step, but indeed a step in the right direction coming from Zimbabwe. Thank you for talking to us today.
No, you are welcome. We are very happy. Remember, we recently won the UN seat as a non-permanent member, and the support from African countries was massive. And this donation should be celebrated, because to us as Zimbabweans, our feeling is that the president is starting implementing measures that will ensure that the African continent is using its local resources to fight local problems.
And with that conversation, we come to the end of our show. It has been a packed one. We've been speaking about President Cyril Ramaphosa's address to the nation, in which he confronted some of the concerns of South Africans regarding illegal immigration. After that, we went all the way to Zimbabwe, where they have pledged a $1 million donation to the Africa Center for Disease Control to help combat the scourge of Ebola in Central and Eastern Africa, highlighting the importance of health sovereignty in our interview with Mr. Lazarus Sauti. I have been Seakga Tladi. I will be back with more, but for today, I'm out of here.